Periodically, I get a chance to watch the talk shows on Sunday. Or if I don't watch them, at least I can follow with them by reading the transcripts. Today, it was Secretary Geithner on ABC News. As I listen to his report, and as I read the transcript of the conversation between him and George Stephanopoulos, I wonder about our Treasury Secretary. There are certain inconsistencies that he believes, and well, I think that he's wrong-headed in many places. Take, for example, in an early comment he made, where he's actually praising how the President's plan to get people to refinance their mortgages, in fact, the economic data was saying that the number of mortgages was going up and such like that, laying praise to the President's plan in this. But then later on turn around saying, yeah, but it was excessive borrowing that got us into trouble. Well, make up your mind. Do you want people to borrow money or not? Or why is one type of borrowing okay for the rest of it toxic? In fact, a direct quote. We have a recession like this, which is born out of a period where people borrowed too much, and we let our financial system take on too much risk. So naturally, we want people borrowing again. That's not consistent. Now, you also have to realize that George Stephanopoulos worked close with the Clinton regime back in the 90s. And so some of the questions that came to the Treasury Secretary were shaped from that. For example, the notion of a new form of economy breaking out. They were citing some kind of report from Citicorp. Well, here's the problem. Their contention was kind of the end of the boom times. In other words, the normal roller coaster that we associate with the business cycle, but to level it out. And even the question of income equity came into play. And sure enough, our Treasury Secretary was put on the record to say that, yeah, we're trying to eliminate some of the broad income inequity. Well, there's a problem. Income inequity, it's a natural state of affairs. If you were to give every person $50,000 and wait around to see how that $50,000 is spent, 5 years later, you're going to have a bunch of people who have a whole lot more than $50,000, and you're going to have a whole bunch of people that are broke. So much for income inequity being a problem. It's going to happen on its own. In fact, these guys were making comparisons with the 1990s, where the wealth was a little bit more drawn out, and there was a time of prosperity. But they forget one small problem at the end of the 90s. Whereas the prosperity was part of the tech boom, it did come to a bust. I thought we were trying to eliminate the boom-bust cycle. And they were talking about the 1990s and the tech run-up that then imploded at the end of the 90s, early part of the 2000s. I don't think they got their history very well. But most of the discussion dealt with the fact that our government needs the banks and the investors to take up some of the slack. Well, there's complication with that. Consider it, this past week, the heads of a lot of these major banks were sitting around the table, with President Obama, trying to discuss how they can help out. Or more importantly, what is the government going to demand of them? Because the whole notion of trying to buy up the toxic assets, well, means that the banks and these holders have to sell them the assets. The price of those assets really haven't been defined yet. They're hoping that maybe they can get some private investors involved. Because if the government takes it all, they're saying, well, if we price it all, it may not be fair. We need private investors and their expertise and their minds to help us out here. But realize, any form of bailout has strings attached. And maybe these banks don't want the strings attached. The successful banks, the ones that are strong, they don't need the government's help. As a consequence, they have no reason to sell off their toxic assets. The government, unfortunately, needs those toxic assets The government needs the banks more than the banks need the government. And then, of course, comes the question, with all this bailout money and all this money free-flowing, does that mean then that our government is just going to kick on the printing presses and start printing off Benjamins to meet the bailout money? Isn't that going to cause some form of inflation, or worse yet, hyperinflation? They're talking about how we're going to build up infrastructure. That was pointed out by a guy who commented into that report. Look at his infrastructure if I can't afford to drive my car over it because of the hyperinflation. Now realize, our Treasury Secretary worked with the Federal Reserve. So naturally, he's going to toe the party line saying, oh, the Federal Reserve is not going to let that happen. You know, we're going to keep inflation down. Yeah, I remember the 70s with double-digit inflation. Where was the Fed then? But here comes the whole kicker at the very end, and the whole philosophy behind the Treasury Secretary. And it's in this quote from him. Great obligation, responsibility for governments is to act to solve these things. The market will not solve these, and the greater risk for us is that we do too little, not that we do too much. That pretty well sums up his whole philosophy. You know, the private sector is screwed up. We have the government. We're the intelligent ones. We can save you. Well, if that's the case, they need to get their own acts, all their ducks in a row. Because some of the things he said, the government may be trying to fix it, but the private industry and the private investors and the private banks have to play along with it. If they don't play along with it, the government can do nothing.